morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will now proceed with the government's opening statement. Please proceed. This is a case about a violent gang called the Blood Hound Brims. For over a decade, members of the Blood Hound Brims committed crimes together. They flooded the streets of New York City and upstate New York with crack cocaine, powder cocaine, and heroin. They amassed an arsenal of guns and ammunition, and they used those guns repeatedly to try to kill other people. Guns, drugs, violence, power. That's what the Blood Hound Brims was all about. Now, sitting in the courtroom this morning are three high-ranking leaders of the Blood Hound Brims. It's the defendants, Latique Johnson, Brandon Green, and Donnell Murray. This man, Latique Johnson, was the founder and the head of the Blood Hound Brims. They called him La Brim. You'll learn that La Brim is the man who called the shots in this gang. He wrote the rules. He handed down the discipline to members of the gang who were under him. He declared war on rival gangs. He personally committed and he ordered people under him to commit brutal acts of violence. They called him the Godfather, the GF of the Blood Hound Brims. His word was the gang version of the law. This man, Brandon Green, was another high-ranking member of the Blood Hound Brims. He goes by the name Light. You'll see that Light was one of the main drug suppliers for the Blood Hound Brims. That's how this gang made money. They sold illegal drugs in New York City and upstate New York. You're also going to learn that Light kept a stash of loaded guns for the Blood Hound Brims. And this man, Donnell Murray, rose to become one of La Brim's most trusted lieutenants in the Blood Hound Brims. You'll learn he goes by the name Don P. You'll learn that Don P sold drugs and carried drugs with other members of the Blood Hound Brims, and he participated in some of the Brim's most brazen acts of violence. La Brim, Light, Don P. These three men ran a criminal organization that operated by its own code, a code of power and violence, with no respect for the law or public safety. They treated parts of New York like their own shooting range, their own open-air drug market. For year after year, they engaged in acts of violence and drug dealing, with no regard for the damage they were causing to the community. That's why we're here. For the crimes they committed with the Blood Hound Brims, the defendants stand charged with racketeering offenses, firearm offenses, and narcotics offenses. So let me take a step back and tell you what the evidence in this case is going to show and how we're going to prove it. First, what will the evidence show? The evidence in this case is going to show that La Brim founded the Blood Hound Brims in 2005. Many of the gang's first members were inmates at New York State prisons. And you'll learn that the gang had operations from within the New York State prison system. But the gang quickly spread from the prisons to the public streets. By 2015, the Blood Hound Brims had hundreds of members in all 5 boroughs of New York City. But the gang didn't just stop in New York. It had members in locations all across the country, in places like Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, all the way to Texas. Light and Don P. stood right under La Brim overseeing this huge criminal organization. You're going to learn that the Blood Hound Brims was a highly organized gang. Members moved up and kept their status in the gang, mostly based on the acts of violence and the crimes they committed. Members of the Blood Hound Brims had to take an oath of loyalty to the gang. They had to go to meetings that were held by the gang, and they had to pay membership fees. There was even a written code of conduct and a set of rules that all the members had to live by. If anyone broke the rules, they were disciplined, sometimes violently. You're also going to hear about specific crimes that these defendants committed and ordered other people to commit for the Blood Hound Brims. Those crimes include violence in New York State prisons, slashings in jails, slashings where razors and scalpels were used as weapons, slashings that were ordered by the defendant, La Brim, the boss of the Blood Hound Brims. Those crimes also include the sale of drugs on the streets of New York City and beyond New York City. You're going to learn how large quantities of crack cocaine, powder cocaine, and heroin were transported from New York City to small towns in upstate New York, places like Elmira, where they were sold to drug addicts. The defendant Light was one of the leaders of that drug operation that went from New York City to upstate New York. But Light and the other members of the gang didn't just take advantage of drug addicts by taking their money and selling them drugs. They also used them. They used them to drive members of the gang around in cars. They used their homes as stash houses. And they bribed them with free drugs for finding new drug customers. Members of the gang also brought their guns with them to upstate New York, using them for protection while they sold drugs. You're also going to hear about violent conflicts that developed between the Blood Hound Brims and other gangs operating in the Bronx. A crucial part of the image and reputation of the Blood Hound Brims was how it dealt with these rival gangs. So anytime the Blood Hound Brims were disrespected, they retaliated with swift and brutal violence. In the fall of 2012, Brim ordered the members of the Blood Hound Brims to commit a drive-by shooting at rival gang members in the Bronx. When they received these orders from the boss, Brim, they didn't hesitate to carry them out. They committed a shooting on a public street in the middle of a residential neighborhood in the Bronx. And earlier that year, in January 2012, Brim personally used an AK-47 rifle to shoot at people who were inside a restaurant in the Bronx. You'll hear that Brim stood outside the restaurant on a public street with the AK-47, and he opened fire, sending numerous shots through the windows of the restaurant, trying to hit members of a rival gang who were inside. He hit his intended victims, and they suffered gunshot wounds. And you're going to learn that the person who served as Brim's getaway driver, the person who drove him to the scene of the shooting and helped him escape after he shot up a legitimate business on a public street, was one of his top lieutenants in the Blood Hound Brims, the defendant, Don P. That's what the evidence in this case is going to show. It's going to show that these defendants, Brim, Light, and Don P., served at the top of a widespread criminal organization that inflicted brutal acts of violence and drug dealing over and over again in New York City and beyond, with no regard for the law or public safety. Now, how are we going to prove it? There's going to be many different types of evidence in this case. First, you're going to see physical evidence. You will see a pile of guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition seized from members of the Blood Hound Brims. We will show you the 6 loaded guns seized from Light on the day of his arrest. You're also going to see drugs seized from members of the Blood Hound Brims, but not just drugs. You're also going to see the tools of the drug trade, the equipment that goes along with drug dealing. You're going to see grinders, strainers, digital scales that are used to weigh the drugs, the glassine envelopes that are used to package the drugs. You're also going to see financial records showing some of the money from the sale of drugs in upstate New York flowing back to New York City. You're also going to see documents, paperwork seized from members of the gang that actually lays out, in writing, the structure, the history, and the rules of the Blood Hound Brims. Some of that gang paperwork will list secret code words used by members of the gang to talk about drugs, guns, knives, and shootings. These are some of the types of evidence that you're going to see during this trial. But there's also a type of evidence that you're going to hear. Audio recordings of phone calls that Brim made while he was in prison. Phone calls he made while he was still running the Blood Hound Brims from inside a jail. During these phone calls, you're going to hear Brim talk about the Blood Hound Brims in his own words. You're going to hear many of the secret code words that you're going to see in that gang paperwork. You're going to hear Brim giving orders, handing out discipline, and demanding money from other members of the Blood Hound Brims. You're also going to hear from witnesses who will appear in court and testify before you under oath. You're going to hear from law enforcement officers at every level, local, state, and federal. The law enforcement officers will testify about how they collected evidence and seized guns and drugs from members of the Blood Hound Brims. You're also going to hear from witnesses who were at the scene of the shooting at the restaurant that I described earlier. You'll hear their description of the destruction, the broken glass, the shell casings, and the victims with their gunshot wounds. You're also going to hear from other members of the Blood Hound Brims who committed crimes right alongside these 3 defendants. Now make no mistake, these witnesses, like the defendants who are participants in the gang, have committed serious crimes. Some of them have even committed murders. And these witnesses will tell you they're not just testifying out of the goodness of their hearts. Each of them entered into an agreement with the government to cooperate, to provide information and to testify, in hopes of receiving less jail time. But your common sense will tell you that only other members of the Blood Hound Brims can give you a view from the inside as to how this gang operated and the crimes that these defendants committed. So the question is not going to be whether you like these witnesses or approve of the things they've done. The only question is whether they're telling you the truth. So listen to their testimony, scrutinize it carefully, and consider how it fits together with all of the other evidence that you're going to see and hear. The guns, the drugs, the financial records, the documents, the recordings, the testimony from other witnesses, all of the other evidence in this case. By the end of this trial, all of the evidence will come together, and you're going to know exactly what happened here. The defendants, Brim, Light, and Don P., were leaders of a powerful and lawless gang that inflicted brutal acts of violence and drug dealing on the New York City area and beyond for many years. Now, towards the end of this trial, when all the evidence has been presented, we'll have another opportunity to speak to you about how the evidence proves up in each of the individual charges in this case. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask that you do 3 things. First, pay close attention to the evidence. Second, follow Judge Gardeffi's instructions on the law. And finally, use your common sense. It's the same common sense that you use every day, the same wisdom and good judgment that you bring to every important decision that you make. If you do these 3 things, the defendants will receive a fair trial, and you're going to reach the only verdict that's consistent with the evidence and the law, that the defendants are guilty.